The carriage was already moving when Eleanor Voss made her decision. She had been standing at the edge of the station platform for 3 full minutes, her small brown trunk beside her, her handbag held in both hands, watching the slow gray morning settle over the northern countryside like a wet cloth pressed against glass. The letter from Ashmore Hall was folded inside her coat pocket, close to her chest, and she had read it so many times in the past 4 days that she could recite it from memory without effort. The Duke of Ashmore required a governess for 2 young wards in his care. The position required immediate occupancy. The salary was more than she had earned in her previous 2 posts combined. She had been warned, of course. Her friend Nell Downing, who worked as a lady's companion in York, had tilted her head in that careful way she had and said, "3 governesses in 6 weeks, Eleanor. 3. As if the number alone was enough to settle the matter. Eleanor had folded the letter back into its envelope and said, "Then they need someone who will stay." That had been 4 days ago. Now she stood on the platform and watched a man in a gray coat argue with the station master about the arrival time of a coal freight, and she thought about her father, who had been dead for 4 months, and about the house in Derbyshire that had been sold to pay his debts, and about the fact that she had 11 shillings in her bag and no family left in England that would take her in without making her feel the weight of it every single day. The carriage from Ashmore Hall arrived 17 minutes late. The driver did not apologize. He simply looked at her trunk, looked at her, and said, "Miss Voss?" "Yes," she said. "Right then," he said, and lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing. The road to Ashmore Hall ran north for nearly 2 hours, through country that grew steadily wilder the further they went. The stone walls along the fields were old and uneven, patched and repatched over generations. The trees were bare. It was the 2nd day of October, and the warmth had left the air entirely, replaced by something cleaner and harder. The kind of cold that made you feel awake whether you wanted to be or not. Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and watched the landscape change through the carriage window, and she did not let herself feel afraid. She had been afraid, in the weeks after her father's funeral, in a way that she had never been afraid before. It was not a loud fear. It was quiet, and it sat in her chest like a stone, and it made even simple things feel difficult. Getting out of bed, eating, writing letters. She had written 12 letters in those weeks, to former employers and to schools and to placement agencies, and she had received 6 replies, and of those 6, only 2 had offered actual positions. One was in London, teaching piano to the daughters of a draper, and the other was this: Ashmore Hall, the Duke of Ashmore, 2 children, and a salary that suggested the Duke was either very desperate, or very difficult, or possibly both. She had chosen this one. She had chosen it because the salary meant she would be free of debt within a year, and because the North felt far enough from everything that had broken to let her breathe again, and because she had told herself, very firmly, that she was not the kind of woman who chose the easier path simply because it was easier. She was 26 years old. She was the daughter of a clergyman who had loved books more than money and poetry more than practicality, and she had inherited his love of both, without inheriting any of his cheerful disregard for consequence. She could speak French tolerably, read Latin slowly, play the pianoforte well, and teach almost anything, to almost anyone provided they were willing to sit still long enough to learn. She had been a governess for 3 years, first to 2 girls in Cheshire, and then to a boy in Northumberland, and in both posts she had been considered, by all accounts, extremely capable and somewhat difficult. The somewhat difficult part did not trouble her. She knew what it meant. It meant she had opinions. It meant she did not pretend to agree when she disagreed. It meant that when the boy in Northumberland's father had told her that discipline meant fear, she had told him, politely and clearly, that in her experience it meant the opposite, and that she had stood by that belief, even when it had cost her the post. She was not, in other words, the kind of woman who was easily managed. She suspected that this was exactly what the children at Ashmore Hall needed, and exactly what the Duke of Ashmore was not going to enjoy. The gates of Ashmore Hall appeared around a long bend in the road, iron and stone, older than anything Eleanor had seen since visiting a cathedral with her father when she was 12. The gatekeeper was an elderly man, with very little to say. He simply opened the gate, nodded once, and closed it behind them. The drive was long and lined with elm trees that had dropped most of their leaves, so that the ground on either side was carpeted in brown and gold. Eleanor looked out at them, and thought that in spring, when the leaves came back, this would be an extraordinary sight. Now, in October, it was simply beautiful, in the way that bare things are beautiful, without disguise. The house itself appeared at the end of the drive like a sentence that has been building for a long time. It was large, and gray, and very old, and it sat in its grounds with the particular stillness of buildings that have seen everything and are not impressed by any of it. There were 3 stories on the main block and a long wing on each side, and the windows were tall and narrow, and every single one of them appeared, from the outside, to be completely dark. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage before the driver could help her, and she stood on the gravel and looked up at the house, and she took one long, steady breath. The front door opened before she reached it. A woman appeared, tall and straight, perhaps 50, with dark hair pulled back with such precision that it looked almost architectural. She was wearing black, which Eleanor understood to be a permanent condition, rather than mourning. "Miss Voss," the woman said, not a question. "Yes," Eleanor said. "And you are Mrs. Holt, I believe." Something moved in the woman's expression, very briefly, that might have been surprise. "I am. His Grace is expecting you in the study at 4 o'clock. It is presently 2:30. I will show you to your rooms." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "And the children? When shall I meet them?" Mrs. Holt paused, just slightly, on the top step. "His Grace prefers to introduce you himself, after your meeting with him." "Of course," Eleanor said, and followed the housekeeper inside. The entrance hall was large and cool, and smelled of old wood and beeswax, and, very faintly, of something that might have been a fire burning somewhere deep in the house. The floor was stone, the walls were hung with portraits, and Eleanor glanced at them as she walked, noting the family resemblance that ran through the faces like a thread. The same strong jaw, the same dark eyes, the same expression that suggested they were reserving judgment. Her rooms were on the 2nd floor of the east wing, which was not the family's part of the house, and was not meant to be. The sitting room was small, but had a good window that looked out over the walled kitchen garden, and, beyond it, a stretch of open moorland that extended until it met a gray sky. The bedroom was plain, with a narrow bed and a writing table, and a wardrobe that smelled of cedar. The fireplace had been lit in advance of her arrival, and the fire was small but real, and Eleanor stood in front of it for a moment, with her hands held out, and felt something ease, slightly, in her chest. She had 2 hours before she was required to meet the Duke. She spent them unpacking her trunk, arranging her books on the small shelf beside the writing table, and sitting down to write a letter to Nell Downing that she would not finish for another 3 days. She wrote, "I have arrived. The house is larger than I expected and colder than I feared, but the fire in my room is very good, and the view of the moor is extraordinary. I have not met His Grace yet. I have not met the children yet. But I have not run away either, which I believe counts as a promising beginning." At 4 o'clock, exactly, she knocked on the study door. "Come in," said a voice that was low and even, and gave away nothing. The study was a long room at the front of the house, and it smelled of leather and paper, and the particular stuffiness of rooms where windows are kept closed against the weather. It was also, despite being large, not particularly comfortable. The furniture was fine and old, and not arranged with any thought for ease. The fire was built up properly, but the room still felt stiff, as if it had been frozen in some position long ago and had not been invited to change. Edmund Carew, the 8th Duke of Ashmore, was sitting at his desk when Eleanor came in, and he did not rise. She had not expected him to be young. She had formed a picture in her mind, built from the cold formality of the letter and the stripped-back efficiency of its language, of a man in his late 50s, gray-haired, heavy, the kind of man who wore authority like armor, because he had worn it for so long he could no longer feel the weight. What she found instead was a man who was perhaps 34, though he held himself with such controlled stillness that age seemed almost beside the point. He had dark hair, slightly longer than fashion would have preferred, and dark eyes that fixed on her the moment she came through the door and did not move from her face while she crossed the room toward his desk. He was not handsome in any simple way. His face was too angular for that, the lines of it too deliberate, too used. But it was a face that you would remember. It was a face that had learned a very long time ago not to show what it was thinking, and had become so practiced at this that the blankness itself was a kind of expression. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She did not curtsy. She had decided, on the walk from her rooms, that she would not curtsy. She was an educated woman, in a professional capacity, not a housemaid, and the distinction seemed worth establishing from the beginning. If he noticed, his face did not record it. He gestured to the chair on the other side of the desk without speaking, and she sat down and folded her hands in her lap and met his gaze without looking away. For a moment, he simply looked at her, and she let him, because she was looking at him too, and she thought it was reasonable that they should both take stock of the situation before either of them said anything further. "You have reviewed the terms of the position," he said finally. "I have," she said. "And you understand what is required. You require a governess for Philip and Clara. I am to conduct their lessons, manage their daily routine, and be responsible for their general education and behavior. The terms include accommodation and meals and a salary of £60 per year, reviewed after 6 months." He nodded. "And you understand that 3 women before you have found the position unsuitable." "I understand that 3 women before me chose to leave," Eleanor said. "I do not know that their reasons were the same, or that they are relevant to my own situation." A very small pause. "Is that so?" "Yes," she said. "Every position has its challenges. I have found that the challenges vary considerably, depending on how you approach them." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, "The children are not easy." "Children rarely are," she said, "when they are unhappy." Another pause, longer this time. Something moved in his eyes, barely, like a shift of light on still water. "They are not unhappy," he said. "They lack structure." Eleanor did not say what she was thinking, which was that the two things were not as separate as he believed. She said, "Then I will provide structure." "You will not coddle them," he said. It was not a request. "I will teach them," she said. "The method is mine to determine." He looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, and not quite displeasure, and not quite anything she could easily name. Then he said, "Very well." He straightened a paper on his desk, a small, deliberate movement that she suspected was what he did when he wanted to close a conversation. "You will dine in the schoolroom. You will not join the family at dinner. You will address me as your Grace. You will not discuss the household's affairs with the children, or with the staff, beyond what is necessary for your duties. Is that understood?" "Completely," she said. "Then I think we are finished for today," he said. "Mrs. Holt will bring the children to the schoolroom tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. You may spend this evening settling in." "Thank you," Eleanor said. She stood and smoothed her skirt and turned to go. "Miss Voss." She turned back. He was still looking at her, and something in his expression had shifted, fractionally, from the closed flatness of a man conducting an interview to something else, something that was harder to categorize. He said, 3 governesses in 6 weeks is not a record I am proud of." It was, she realized, the closest he could come, in that moment, to an apology, or perhaps to honesty. "Then I hope," she said, "to give you something better to record." He nodded once, the way a man nods when he has nothing more to say and knows it, and Eleanor walked back through the long study and out the door and down the corridor to the east wing, and she stood for a moment in the hall and breathed. The house was cold. The Duke was colder. But the children were here somewhere, and they were unhappy, and that she understood completely, and she knew, with the particular certainty that sometimes comes when you are too tired and too sad to pretend otherwise, that she was going to stay. She went down to supper alone in the schoolroom, which smelled of chalk and old paper, and a kind of specific childlike loneliness. She ate cold mutton and bread, and drank 2 cups of strong tea, and watched the October dark come down over the moor outside the window, and she did not feel sorry for herself, and she did not feel afraid. She felt, for the first time in 4 months, as though she had somewhere to be. In the morning, she would meet Philip and Clara. In the morning, everything would begin, and if it was difficult, that was all right. Difficult was something she knew how to manage. She was, after all, not the kind of woman who chose the easier path. She washed her face in the cold water from the jug on the washstand, and braided her hair, and climbed into the narrow bed in the plain bedroom, while the fire burned down to coals. and she slept deeply, and without dreaming, for the first time in a very long time. Outside, the wind came in off the moor and moved through the bare elm trees along the drive, and Ashmore Hall stood in the dark the way it always stood, the way it had stood for 200 years, heavy and still and keeping its secrets. But something had changed, just slightly, just enough. A light was out in the east wing. A woman had arrived who had not curtsied, who had not agreed when she disagreed, who had said, very calmly and very clearly, that the method was hers to determine. And somewhere in the dark study at the front of the house, a man who had not been looked at directly, in longer than he could easily remember, sat with a glass of brandy he had barely touched, staring at the fire and thinking about nothing in particular. Or so he told himself. The schoolroom was on the 3rd floor of the north wing, and it was the coldest room Eleanor had yet entered at Ashmore Hall, which was saying something. The fireplace was small, and the chimney clearly drew poorly, because most of the warmth seemed to go sideways, rather than into the room, and the tall windows on the north wall let in a quantity of gray October light that was plentiful, but offered no comfort whatsoever. Eleanor arrived at 20 minutes to 8. She had been awake since 5:30, which was not unusual for her, and she had spent the intervening time drinking tea, brought by a housemaid, who could not have been older than 15, and who looked at Eleanor with an expression of cautious sympathy, as though she were watching someone walk toward something she knew was not going to go well. Eleanor had smiled at her, thanked her for the tea, and not said what she was thinking, which was that the sympathy, however kindly meant, was not necessary. She spent the time before 8 o'clock examining the schoolroom properly. She had only glanced at it the evening before, when Mrs. Holt had shown her through on the initial tour. Now she looked at it carefully, the way you look at a new space when you are trying to understand what has happened in it. The bookshelves were well stocked but disordered, the books shoved in at angles and in no discernible sequence. A globe stood on a stand in the corner, and when Eleanor spun it she found that it was out of date by at least 30 years, and had a crack running from the Arctic to the equator. The writing desks were scarred with the marks of small knives and compass points, which told her something about the previous approach to discipline. On the mantelpiece there were 3 objects: a pottery horse with one ear missing, a piece of gray flint shaped roughly like a duck, and a tiny portrait, the size of a playing card, in a tarnished frame. Eleanor picked up the portrait and looked at it. It showed a young man, perhaps 25, with a wide smile and an open, pleasant face that was immediately likable. He had the same dark eyes as the Duke, but wore them entirely differently, the way 2 people can share a feature, and it can look like a completely different thing, depending on what is behind it. She put the portrait down carefully, exactly as she had found it. She rearranged the books. She found a clean cloth in the supply cupboard and polished the globe. She pushed the 2 writing desks apart by a few feet, and set each one with a clean sheet of paper and a sharpened pencil. She stoked the fire until it was producing actual heat rather than the suggestion of it. She opened one of the north windows 2 inches, because the room smelled of disuse, and then thought about the children who were coming, and closed it again. At 7 minutes past 8, she heard footsteps on the stairs. She sat down in the chair behind the larger desk, folded her hands, and waited. The door opened, and Philip came through it first, which she would later understand was always the case. He was 8 years old, small for his age, with dark hair that needed cutting, and very serious brown eyes that swept the room before they landed on her, taking inventory, the way a general takes inventory of unfamiliar ground. He was wearing a jacket that was slightly too large for him, and his shoes were polished to a high shine that she suspected was the work of someone other than Philip. He looked at Eleanor the way that children look at adults when they have decided in advance not to like them. Behind him came Clara, who was 6, and who came through the door sideways, with her shoulder against the frame, as if she were not fully committed to being in the room. She had lighter hair than her brother, pulled into 2 braids that were slightly uneven, and blue eyes that were large and watchful in a face that gave very little away. She was holding something in her right hand, and when Eleanor looked at it she saw it was a carved wooden rabbit, small and smooth, with one leg shorter than the others. Mrs. Holt came in behind them and said, "This is Miss Voss, children. She is your new governess." Her voice was not unkind, but it was formal, the voice of someone delivering an announcement rather than making an introduction. Philip looked at Eleanor and said nothing. Clara looked at Eleanor and said nothing. Eleanor looked at them both and said nothing either, for a moment, because she was reading the room, and what she was reading was this. Two children who were not wild, not difficult, not unmanageable, but were frightened, and had been frightened for some time, and had learned that the best response to new adults was to say as little as possible, and wait to see what damage they caused. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt," Eleanor said. "We will be fine." Mrs. Holt looked at her with an expression that clearly indicated she believed this to be optimistic to the point of delusion, but she left without saying so, and the door closed, and Eleanor was alone with Philip and Clara. She did not say good morning. She did not say their names. She did not say anything about being pleased to meet them or looking forward to their lessons, or any of the things that she suspected previous governesses had said, and that had made absolutely no impression. Instead, she reached into the leather satchel she had set beside the desk, and she took out a large, flat book, and she set it open on the desk in front of her, and she began to read aloud. Not a lesson, not a primer. A book of illustrated maps, old and beautiful, with hand-drawn coastlines and sea monsters in the margins, and place names in a script that was elegant and slightly difficult to read. She was reading about the Amazon River, its length and its breadth, and the fact that it carried more water to the sea than any other river in the world, and that the jungle along its banks contained more species of plant and animal than most scientists had yet managed to count. She read in a steady, interested voice, as if she were telling someone something she found genuinely fascinating, not as if she were trying to capture the attention of two suspicious children. She got approximately 90 seconds in before she heard movement. She did not look up. A soft sound, the chair beside the left-hand desk being pulled back an inch, then another inch. She kept reading. She turned the page. There was a map of the river's tributaries, spreading out like the branches of a tree, and she described it with her finger tracing the lines, still not looking up. Philip sat down in the left-hand chair. She heard it creak under his weight. She kept reading. 2 minutes later, there was a very soft padding sound on the floorboards, and something warm and small leaned against her left arm, and she understood that Clara was standing beside the desk, looking at the map. Eleanor moved the book slightly to the left, so that Clara could see it more clearly, without comment, and without looking at her, and she kept reading. By the time she reached the part about the pink river dolphins that lived in the deeper channels of the Amazon, and were considered, by the people who lived along the river's banks, to be magical creatures that took human form at night, Philip had moved his chair close enough to see the page, and Clara had pulled the spare chair around to Eleanor's other side, and was sitting in it, with the wooden rabbit on her knee. Eleanor looked up. Two faces looked back at her, close and intent, the wariness not entirely gone but slightly loosened, the way a fist slowly opens. "Would you like to see the map of the Congo?" Eleanor asked, as if continuing a perfectly normal conversation that had been going on for some time. "Is it bigger than the Amazon?" Philip asked. "Smaller," Eleanor said, "but older, I think. More ancient." "Ancient means very old," Clara said to Philip, in a tone that suggested she was not entirely sure whether she was right, but was willing to commit. "It does," Eleanor said, "very well remembered." Clara looked at the book. Then she looked up at Eleanor, the careful assessment of someone who has been disappointed before, and is not sure whether to allow for the possibility of something different. Then she looked back at the book. "Can we see it?" Philip asked. "Of course," Eleanor said, and turned the page. That was the first lesson. It lasted 3 hours, and it was not a lesson in any traditional sense at all. They looked at maps, and Eleanor told them stories, not invented ones but true ones, about the people and places the maps showed. They talked about rivers and mountains, and the way that ice moves, very slowly, like a river made of cold. Clara asked 17 questions, most of them starting with, "But why?" and Eleanor answered every single one, without losing patience, because the questions were excellent, and patience was not something she had ever found difficult when a question deserved an answer. Philip said less, but watched more. He had the stillness of a child who thinks before he speaks, which was, Eleanor noted, a quality he shared with his guardian, though in Philip, it came from thoughtfulness rather than control. When Mrs. Holt came at midday to take the children to luncheon, Philip paused at the door and turned back, and said, with great care and no expression, "The map book." Will it still be here tomorrow? It lives here now, Eleanor said. It is not going anywhere. He nodded once, very formally, as if they had reached a satisfactory agreement on a matter of business, and left. Clara, who was half through the door, turned back too, and looked at Eleanor for a moment. Then she held up the wooden rabbit. His name is Walter, she said. That is a very good name for a rabbit, Eleanor said. Clara nodded seriously and went out, and the door closed, and Eleanor sat alone in the cold schoolroom, with the fire burning properly now, and the window full of gray October sky, and she thought about what she had seen that morning. 2 frightened children who were kind and curious and desperately in need of someone who would stay. A household that held its breath, a house that was full of careful, polished silence. And somewhere below her, in a study at the front of the building, a man who had reduced the world to rules because he did not trust it to be kind without them. She thought about his face in that first meeting, the way it had been so still, so controlled, and the single moment when it had not been, when something had moved through his eyes like weather, quick and gone. She had said that the children were unhappy, and he had said they were not, and he had been wrong, and some part of him had known it. She did not dislike him for that. She understood it. It is easier, sometimes, to diagnose a problem as a lack of structure than to acknowledge that what is missing is warmth, because structure is something you can impose without making yourself vulnerable, and warmth requires a willingness to be changed by the people you give it to. She had been thinking about her father again, on and off, all morning. He had been warm the way that rivers are warm in summer, completely and without effort, and it had cost him everything material, and given him everything else, and she had watched him live that way her entire life, and she had thought, for a long time, that she was not quite brave enough to do the same. She was beginning to think she might have been wrong about that. She collected the map book and put it back in its place on the newly organized shelf, and she went to her desk and began to write out a plan for the coming week. Something thoughtful and gentle that would teach without feeling like instruction. Something that would meet the children where they were, rather than where she wished them to be. Outside the window, a wind came in off the moor and pressed against the glass, and the bare elms in the drive moved, and the house settled around her with a sound that was like a slow, deep breath. She had been here one day. She had not yet run. She had not yet been asked to leave. She thought that was, all things considered, a reasonable beginning. She pressed her pen to the paper and kept writing, and the fire burned steadily behind her, and the schoolroom, which had been cold and silent and smelled of old disappointment, began, slowly and almost without being noticed, to feel like somewhere that was used. Down on the ground floor, in the study at the front of the house, the Duke of Ashmore sat with the estate accounts open in front of him, and had not read a single figure in the past 30 minutes. He had heard, faintly, through the thick floors of the old house, the sound of voices. He had told himself he was not listening. He had been listening. The children's voices he knew, though he heard them rarely, because they were usually brought to him in the library, for a brief, formal half-hour on Sunday afternoons, which was all his schedule permitted, which was what he told himself. Clara's voice, which was light and quick and asked questions faster than anyone could answer them. Philip's voice, which was slower and more careful, the voice of a boy who worried that speaking might somehow make things worse. He knew why Philip worried that. He was not able to address it. That was the simple and terrible truth of it, and he had learned, in the 14 months since his brother died and the children had come to Ashmore, that the only way through a thing you cannot address is to move around it. And so he moved around it, every day, with great care, and he told himself that structure and routine, and good food, and proper education would do what he could not do, and that this was responsible and sensible, and the right approach. And then this woman had arrived, with her composed face and her steady gaze, and her refusal to curtsy, and she had sat across from him, and told him that the method was hers to determine, and he had felt, in that moment, something that he was not going to examine too closely. He picked up his pen and returned to the accounts. Outside, the wind moved through the elms, and the house settled, and the afternoon came on slowly, gray and cold and ordinary. But something had begun, something small and quiet and not yet named, the way a river begins, far up in the hills, before anyone knows where it is going. November arrived at Ashmore Hall the way it always did, without ceremony and without apology, replacing October's gray cold with a cold that had weight to it, a solidity that settled into the stone of the old house and stayed there. The fires throughout the building were built up higher, and the housemaids had the permanent flushed look of people who were constantly moving between two hot rooms and two cold corridors, and the grounds outside went from autumnal to something starker, something pared down, the moor showing its true face now that the softer colors of late summer had gone. Eleanor had been at Ashmore Hall for 5 weeks. In those 5 weeks, she had established what Philip called, with the grave precision of an 8-year-old who has decided to accept something, a routine. Lessons in the morning, 3 days a week structured, 2 days exploratory, which meant that she brought in unusual things, and they examined them together, without any particular agenda. She had brought a piece of basalt from the moor, and they had talked about volcanoes. She had brought a book of botanical illustrations, and they had tried to draw from it, Clara producing something that looked more like a bird than a plant, but with a genuine attention to the curves of leaf and stem. Philip producing something exact and careful, and slightly stiff, that showed a mind that valued accuracy above imagination, but was beginning, slowly, to trust itself to try the second thing. Clara had, in week 3, begun leaving Walter the rabbit on Eleanor's desk when they went down to luncheon. Not every day, but often enough that Eleanor understood it was deliberate, a small act of placement that meant something. She never mentioned it to Clara, and Clara never explained it, and the rabbit sat on the corner of the desk with his 3 full legs and 1 short one, and watched the room in the way that well-loved objects seem to watch rooms, with a presence that is out of proportion to their size. Philip had, in week 4, brought her something from outside. He had said nothing about it, simply put it on the desk one morning before sitting down. A small, smooth stone, dark gray, nearly perfectly round. Eleanor had turned it over in her fingers and said, "Where did you find this?" "The East Stream," he said, "below the second bridge." "It has been in a river for a very long time," she said, "to be this smooth." "I thought about that," he said, and then he sat down and opened his arithmetic book and said nothing more. But Eleanor understood that the giving of the stone was significant, a form of trust, extended in the only way he currently knew how. She put the stone in her desk drawer, and it stayed there. The staff at Ashmore Hall had also, over the 5 weeks, undergone a shift. Not a dramatic one, nothing said openly, but a shift in small things. Mrs. Holt, who had regarded Eleanor's arrival with something very close to professional skepticism, now stopped in the corridor occasionally, to pass on information that was not strictly necessary, but was useful. That the chimney in the schoolroom drew better if the damper was opened a particular way. That Clara ate well, but always refused cabbage. That Philip had nightmares sometimes, and that a light left burning in the corridor outside his room seemed to help. Mrs. Holt did not explain why she was sharing this information. She simply shared it, with the neutral efficiency of someone performing an administrative task, and Eleanor received it in the same spirit, with thanks that did not make too much of what was happening between them. What was happening was that Eleanor was being trusted, slowly, carefully, the way trust always moves in a household that has been through difficulty, not all at once but in increments so small that you could miss them if you were not paying attention. She was paying attention. She was also, she had noticed, paying attention to other things she had not planned to pay attention to. She had seen the Duke 3 times in the 5 weeks since her arrival. The first was in the entrance hall when she had just come in from a walk with the children, and he was crossing toward the library, and he had stopped very briefly and looked at the 3 of them. Philip and Clara flushed from the cold and talking, and his expression had done something complicated and unguarded that was over before she could read it, and he had said, "Miss Voss," and she had said, "Your Grace," and he had nodded and continued to the library. The second time had been in the corridor outside the schoolroom. She had been carrying a heavy box of books from the storage room on the upper floor, and she had come around the corner rather too quickly and nearly collided with him, and he had reached out and steadied the box with both hands before it could tip, and for a moment his hands and hers were on the box together, very close, and she had been aware of this in a way that she refused to examine. He had said, "What are these?" in a voice that was attempting to be ordinary and almost succeeding. She had said, "Scientific texts." I thought Philip might like geology. He had looked at the box for a moment, and then he had said, "He used to ask our father about rocks," and the past tense of that sentence had landed in the air between them, with the quiet weight of something, that had not been said in a long time. She had said, "I know," not because she knew the specifics, but because she understood the shape of it. He had taken the box from her and carried it to the schoolroom without another word. The third time had been across the grounds. She had taken the children out on a Tuesday morning when the weather was, briefly, not actively threatening, and they had gone down to the east stream below the second bridge where Philip had found his stone, and when she looked up she had seen, at the far end of the south lawn, the Duke on horseback, moving along the edge of the tree line. He was too far away for her to see his expression, but he had not been moving. He had been still, watching them, for long enough that she was certain he was watching, and then he had turned the horse and ridden back into the trees. She thought about that, sometimes, in the evenings when the children were in bed, and the schoolroom was empty, and she sat at her desk with her letters, or her books, and the fire burned down, and the moor was dark outside. She did not know what she thought about it. She knew only that she was thinking about it, which was itself worth noting. It was on a Thursday evening in the second week of November that it happened. Eleanor had stayed late in the schoolroom, because Clara had started a project she was determined to finish, a drawing of the Amazon River with all its tributaries labeled, which had begun as a geography exercise and had turned into something else entirely, a sprawling, colorful, slightly chaotic map that covered an entire sheet of good paper and had 3 separate drawings of pink river dolphins in the margins. Clara had finally been taken off to bed by her nursemaid at 7:30, cross and only slightly mollified by Eleanor's assurance that the map would absolutely be here in the morning and that the dolphins were extremely good and that she should sleep. Eleanor had stayed to tidy up, which meant recapping the ink pots and washing the brushes and putting the map somewhere flat so it could dry without wrinkling. She had also, if she was being honest, been sitting at her desk for the past half hour, with a novel open in front of her, that she was not quite reading, listening to the wind outside and thinking. She heard the footsteps before she expected them, firm, even, unhurried, on the stairs. Not Mrs. Holt, whose footsteps were quick and purposeful, not any of the housemaids, who tended to run. These were the footsteps of someone who moved through the house as if the house were his, because it was. He stopped in the open doorway. Eleanor looked up. The Duke of Ashmore was still in his evening clothes, which meant he had been at dinner, which meant he had come directly from the dining room to this part of the house, which was the east wing, 3rd floor, and which was not on the way to anywhere that he would normally go. He looked at the room, at the drying map, at the clean desk, at the fire, at Eleanor. "The fire is still burning," he said. "I was reading," she said. She closed her novel. He came into the room, not far, just far enough to no longer be in the doorway, and he looked at Clara's map, which was laid out flat on the second desk to dry. He bent slightly to look at it more closely, at the dolphins in the margin. "Clara's," Eleanor said. "I assumed," he said. Something moved in his voice, something that was not quite amusement, but was in the same family. She drew them as people draw a thing they have imagined very clearly. "She has," Eleanor said. "She thinks about them constantly, since we read about them. She asked me this morning whether, if a dolphin turned into a person at night, the person would still be wet." A brief silence. Then, very quietly, he said, "What did you tell her?" "I told her I thought they would be dry," Eleanor said, "because they would have brought towels." Another silence. And then something happened to the Duke's face that she had not seen before, and would remember for a long time afterward. He laughed. It was not a large laugh, not the kind that fills a room. It was small and quiet and slightly rusty, the laugh of someone who does not do it very often, and it lasted only a moment, but it was completely real, and it changed his face entirely, and Eleanor looked at him in that moment, and felt something shift inside her that she was not entirely prepared for. He stopped laughing. His face returned to its usual careful arrangement. He straightened up from looking at the map. "She is sleeping," he said. A statement, not a question. "Since 7:30, Eleanor said. "Philip was in bed by 8. He is reading, I expect, but he is at least horizontal." Another small shift in his expression. "He reads at night with a candle?" "He does," Eleanor said. "I have arranged for a proper reading lamp to be put in his room. It is better for his eyes." He looked at her. That was not approved. "No," she agreed. I asked Mrs. Holt, and she said it was not the usual practice. I told her that I was the governess, and that the care of the children's eyes and habits was within my professional responsibility, and that I would take full accountability if His Grace objected. A pause. Mrs. Holt told me none of this. No, Eleanor said. I believe she agreed with me. He looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze without looking away, and waited. You are very straightforward, Miss Voss, he said finally. I find it saves time, she said. He looked around the schoolroom once more, at the organized shelves and the smooth globe and the tidy desks, and the map, drying carefully in the lamplight. At Philip's stone on the corner of Eleanor's desk, which she had moved from the drawer to somewhere visible, because it seemed wrong to keep it hidden. He looked at the stone for a moment, then he said, He has not given anything to anyone in quite some time. I know, Eleanor said softly. The word landed in the room between them, and stayed there. She had not planned to say it that way. She had not planned for any of this conversation, but it was the truth, and the truth, her father had told her, is the only thing worth giving people when they are standing in a doorway at 8:30 in the evening, having come somewhere they did not plan to come. He did not say anything else. He stood in the schoolroom for another moment, looking at things she had arranged, and things the children had left behind, and then he looked at her, one more time, and she looked back, and the fire crackled and settled in the grate. Good night, Miss Voss, he said. Good night, Your Grace, she said. He went out, and she heard his footsteps on the stairs, even and unhurried, going back down the way he had come. Eleanor sat for a very long time after that, with her novel closed in her lap, and the fire burning low, and the map drying on the desk, and Philip's stone sitting on the corner, dark and smooth and perfectly round. She thought about a man standing in a doorway, looking at the evidence of his ward's happiness, and the quiet way he had absorbed it, and the moment his face had changed and she had seen something underneath the careful stillness that was not careful and not still at all. She thought about what it means to armor yourself so completely against something that when it arrives anyway, you do not know what to do except stand very still and hope that it goes away before you have to decide anything. She thought about her father, who had never armored himself against anything in his life, and who had died loved and poor and full, and she thought about herself, who had told herself for the past 4 months that she was managing perfectly, and that grief was a thing you moved through, not a thing that moves through you. Outside, the November wind pressed against the glass, and the moor was dark, and Ashmore Hall held its breath, the way it always did, the way old houses hold their breath around things that are beginning. Something was beginning. She was not going to pretend it was not. She received the letter on a Wednesday morning, delivered not by the regular post, but by a private messenger, who rode up the drive on a brown horse, and handed the envelope to the hall boy, with the bored efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Mrs. Holt brought it to Eleanor in the schoolroom during the mid-morning break, when the children had gone to the kitchen for biscuits, and Eleanor was reorganizing the geography shelves. She noted the quality of the paper before she opened it, thick and cream-colored, with a seal in dark red wax. The seal was a bird of some kind, and the handwriting on the outside was large and looping and entirely confident. The letter was from Lady Harriet Vane. Eleanor read it twice. Lady Harriet would be arriving at Ashmore Hall on Friday and remaining through the following Tuesday. She understood that the children's routine was not to be disturbed on her account. She was looking forward to seeing the progress of their education. She signed herself, with every good wish, Harriet Vane, and the good wishes were the kind that do not warm you. Eleanor put the letter on her desk and considered it. She knew about Lady Harriet Vane the way that everyone in the household knew about her, through the careful silence that surrounded the subject, which was more informative than direct conversation would have been. Mrs. Holt said very little about Lady Harriet, but the little she said was precise and neutral, in the way that precision and neutrality become themselves a kind of opinion. The hall boy had once let slip, within Eleanor's hearing, that her ladyship likes the house cold, and had then looked as if he wished he had not said this. 2 of the housemaids had, on the day before Lady Harriet's last visit several months ago, been so thoroughly occupied with flowers and extra linens, and the airing of the blue guest suite, that they had looked, as Eleanor imagined soldiers might look the day before a battle they did not choose. Lady Harriet Vane was 41, widowed at 35, and in possession of a fortune, a London house, and a position in society that meant her name appeared regularly in the newspapers, in connection with charitable events and important dinners. She was, by all available evidence, accomplished, and formidable, and very well connected. She was also, Eleanor had gathered from the careful architecture of every conversation that touched on the subject, being quietly considered by a number of interested parties, including possibly the Duke's own solicitor, as a suitable match for the Duke of Ashmore. Eleanor did not think about this. She filed the letter in the drawer where she kept administrative correspondence, and she went back to the geography shelves, and when the children returned with their biscuits, she gave them a lesson on the rivers of India that was, she would later think, one of the better ones she gave that month. Lady Harriet arrived on Friday afternoon, in a carriage that was finer than anything Eleanor had yet seen on the Ashmore Drive, black and highly polished, with her crest on the door, and 2 matching gray horses pulling it with the smooth, contained energy of very well-bred animals. Eleanor did not watch the arrival from the window. She had absolutely no reason to watch the arrival from the window, and so she did not, except for one brief moment, when the sound of the carriage wheels on the gravel rose up clearly enough to be noticed, and she simply looked out and then looked away again, and that was all. She met Lady Harriet at dinner, not the family dinner, from which Eleanor was still excluded, but a late afternoon tea, to which Eleanor had been, by Mrs. Holt's delivering of the message with her most neutral expression, invited, or summoned. The distinction, Eleanor thought, was not one Lady Harriet herself would recognize. Lady Harriet Vane was tall and fair-haired, and wore her clothes with the ease of someone who has never had to think about whether they suited her, because they always do. She had very clear blue eyes, and the kind of face that had been beautiful at 20, and was striking at 41, in a way that was actually more interesting than beauty had been. She moved through the drawing room with the quiet authority of someone who has occupied every room she has ever entered. She was, Eleanor thought, seated across from her with tea she did not particularly want, genuinely impressive. She was also, Eleanor thought, watching Lady Harriet watch the Duke across the room, with those clear blue eyes, measuring him the way a person measures something they are considering purchasing, making very certain that Eleanor knew she was thinking this, and would not think less of herself for it. The conversation at tea was general and polished. Lady Harriet had opinions about the current season in London, about a new gallery exhibition, about the condition of the northern roads, which she had found, she said, improving, but not yet what they should be. She spoke to Eleanor directly twice, and both times with the pleasant, slightly elevated courtesy of someone who is being generously fair to a person somewhat below their station. "And you find the children responsive, Miss Voss?" she said, on the second occasion. "Very much so," Eleanor said. "They are curious and engaged. I am fortunate in my pupils." "Quite," said Lady Harriet, in a tone that indicated this was an acceptable answer, and also that the answer was complete. She turned to the Duke and said something about a mutual acquaintance in Harrogate, and Eleanor drank her tea and looked at the painting above the fireplace, which showed a hunting scene in a landscape very like the Ashmore grounds, and she kept her face pleasant and thought about nothing in particular. That evening, Eleanor was in the upper sitting room that connected to the schoolroom, writing her weekly letter to Nell Downing, when she heard voices below. She was not trying to hear them. The sitting room shared a chimney flue with the library below, which had the effect, on still evenings when the wind was low, of carrying sounds upward in a way that was not quite eavesdropping, because it was entirely involuntary and mostly unintelligible. She could not hear the words, she could hear the tone. Lady Harriet's voice, even and assured. The Duke's voice, measured and careful. A pause. Lady Harriet again. Something that had a quality of lightness, perhaps amusement. Then the Duke, shorter, a response rather than an initiating statement. Eleanor put her pen down and looked at the letter she had been writing. She had written, "I have now been at Ashmore Hall for 6 weeks, and I find that I am beginning to understand the shape of the place," and then stopped, and she realized she did not know how to continue, because the next thing she would honestly say was that she also found herself understanding the shape of the person at its center, and that this understanding was becoming, she suspected, more significant than was professionally sensible. She did not write that. She wrote about the children. She wrote about the Amazon map, which Clara had now framed, after a fashion, by gluing it to a piece of card, and decorating the border with pressed leaves from the kitchen garden. She wrote about Philip's stone, and about the reading lamp, and about the basalt rock from the moor. She did not write about laughter in the schoolroom doorway, or a box of books carried up 3 flights of stairs without being asked, or a man standing in a lamplight room at 8:30 in the evening, with his eyes on things that other people had made and touched and left behind. She sealed the letter, put it with the others to be sent in the morning, and went to bed. The next morning was Saturday, and on Saturdays the children had the morning free, and Eleanor used the time for preparation and correspondence. She was coming down from the upper floor at 10:30, intending to take her letters to the hall table, when she came around the landing corner and nearly stepped into a conversation that was already happening on the stairs below. Lady Harriet was on the stairs, halfway down, and she was speaking to Mrs. Holt, who was at the bottom, and the voice that carried up was not the pleasant, elevated voice from the tea party, but a slightly sharper version of it, the voice behind the public one. Eleanor stopped on the landing, out of sight around the corner. She was not going to walk into the middle of someone else's conversation, and she was not going to retreat noisily, so she stood still and waited for it to be over. "The children seem well enough," Lady Harriet was saying, and the well enough was doing considerable work. "The governess appears capable." "Miss Voss is very capable," Mrs. Holt said, in a tone that was perfectly agreeable, and gave absolutely nothing away. "Yes," said Lady Harriet. A pause. "She is rather young." 26, said Mrs. Holt. "The position requires energy." Another pause, longer, the kind that has content in it. "His Grace seems to find her satisfactory." "His Grace has noted the improvement in the children," Mrs. Holt said. "He is pleased with their progress." A brief silence. "Quite," said Lady Harriet, and her voice was back to its public register now, pleasant and level. "Well, the house is looking very well, Mrs. Holt. You keep it beautifully." "Thank you, my lady," said Mrs. Holt. Footsteps. Lady Harriet continuing down, then silence. Eleanor stood on the landing for a moment, and breathed slowly, and thought about what she had just heard, and what it meant, and whether she was, in fact, as sensible and clear-headed as she had always believed herself to be. She went down the stairs, and put her letters on the hall table, and went back up to her rooms, and she sat at her writing desk, and looked out at the moor, which was the color of pewter under a low sky, and she thought about her father, who had said to her once, when she was about 16, and being as sensible and clear-headed as she was capable of being, about something that required neither quality. "Eleanor, my love, the difficulty with being very good at knowing what is true is that you cannot unknow it once you know it." She had thought, at 16, that he was talking about the subject at hand. She thought now that he had been talking about this, about the specific difficulty of being someone who sees things clearly when what is in front of you is something you did not plan to see. She looked at the moor for a while longer. Then she opened the top drawer of her writing desk and took out the letter she had begun, and not yet finished, to Nell Downing, and she looked at the last line she had written, about understanding the shape of the place, and she picked up her pen and wrote, "The shape of the place is, I think, more complicated than I first believed." Then she put the pen down, and the letter back in the drawer, and she went to prepare the week's lessons, and she did not let herself think about anything else for the rest of the afternoon. Outside, on the south lawn, on the other side of the house, Lady Harriet Vane walked in the grey November garden, with the Duke of Ashmore, at a correct and appropriate distance, and the wind moved through the bare hedges, and the house watched from its tall windows with its familiar expression of seeing everything, and offering nothing. The East Wing library was not a room Eleanor normally visited. It was not part of the schoolroom floor, and it was not part of the family rooms, and it occupied a peculiar middle position in the house's geography, a long room at the end of a corridor on the first floor, given over to estate records and older household accounts going back more than a century, with a collection of agricultural journals so complete that it extended to 3 full shelves and smelled of everything that paper becomes when it has sat undisturbed for decades. She had gone there on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of November, because Mrs. Holt had mentioned, in passing, that there was a complete set of natural history encyclopedias in the East Wing library that had been ordered by the previous Duke, but never properly catalogued, and Eleanor had thought, immediately and correctly, that Philip would find them extraordinary. She had told herself she would only be 20 minutes. She had been there for 45 when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. The door opened, and the Duke came in. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped where she was, which was on the third step of the rolling library ladder, reaching for a volume on the upper shelf. They looked at each other. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace," she said. She came down from the ladder and held out the book she had retrieved. "I was looking for the natural history series. Mrs. Holt mentioned it was here." He came further into the room, looking at the shelves with the slightly distracted focus of someone who has come here for a different purpose. "I was looking for the drainage survey from 1847, he said. "There is an argument with the tenant at Holt Farm that requires a historical record." "It would be in the estate records section," Eleanor said, "which is the far left, from what I can see. The spines are labeled by year in the grouping above the second window." He looked at her. "You have organized these?" "Only in my head," she said. "I spent some time understanding the system." He moved to the far left section and began looking along the shelf, and Eleanor put the natural history volume down and began gathering the others she had identified for Philip, and for a few minutes they worked in the same room without speaking, each at their separate task, and the fire in the grate at the end of the room put out a steady warmth, and the wind pressed against the windows, and everything was very quiet and very ordinary. Except that it was not ordinary. She was aware of him in the room, in the specific, inconvenient way that she had become aware of him over the past several weeks, with a precision that had nothing to do with professional attention, and everything to do with something she had not yet let herself name. "Got it," he said, and turned from the shelf with a thick ledger in his hands. He looked at it for a moment, then set it on the large central table to examine the relevant sections. Eleanor put her collected volumes on the far end of the same table and made a note in her small book of what she had found. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. That was, perhaps, the strangest thing about it. She had been in rooms with uncomfortable silences, rooms where the quiet was filled with things people were not saying and could not say, where the air itself was tense. This was not that. This was the silence of two people who did not feel the need to fill space with words for its own sake, and who had found, without exactly deciding to, that they were comfortable in the same room without performing anything. She should leave. She had what she came for. She should gather her books and go. She did not immediately go. She was looking at the portrait on the wall above the fireplace, which she had not noticed when she came in. It was a formal portrait, the kind painted for a specific occasion, and it showed a man who was clearly a younger brother. You could see it immediately, in the ease of his posture, the absence of weight in his expression, the smile that belonged to someone who had never had to consider the implications of everything he did. He was perhaps 26 or 27, and he was holding a hat in one hand and a book in the other, and he looked as if he had been caught mid-movement on a happy day, and asked to stop and wait for just a moment. "That is my brother," the Duke said. She had not heard him move, but he was standing beside her now, looking at the portrait. She had not realized how close that was, until she was aware of it. "I know," she said. "I could tell. He looks as if he knew how to be comfortable in rooms." A pause. "He was," the Duke said. "Anywhere, any room, any gathering. People were always glad when he came in." Another pause. "He died 14 months ago. A fever. He was 29 years old." Eleanor said nothing. The kind of nothing that is not emptiness, but fullness. The acknowledgement that some things do not need a response so much as a witness. "Philip is like him," the Duke said, "or will be, I think, if he is allowed to be." "He is already beginning to be," Eleanor said. The Duke looked at the portrait for another moment. Then he looked at her, and she looked at him, and they were standing quite close together in front of the fireplace in the East Wing library, with the November wind outside, and the fire warm behind them, and she was not sure who had moved, or whether either of them had, and she was very aware of his face, of the lines of it, and the dark eyes, and the way they were looking at her, with something in them that was not careful at all. "You said," he said slowly, "on the first day, that the children were unhappy." "Yes," she said. "I told you they were not." "I know," she said. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out as if they had been waiting some time, and had decided to come out whether he permitted them or not. She held very still. "I know that too," she said quietly. He looked at her, she looked back. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind pressed against the old glass, and the elms in the drive moved their bare branches, and the house settled around them with its old, patient sound. "You are very direct," he said. "You said that before," she said. "In October." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about it since." She did not know what to say to that. She did not say anything. She let the statement be there in the room, which was where it wanted to be. He looked away first. He looked at the ledger on the table, the drainage survey from 1847, which had started all of this. He said, "I should deal with the Holt farm matter." "Yes," she said. "And you have books for Philip?" "Yes," she said. He nodded, once. He went back to the table and opened the ledger, and she gathered her books, and she moved toward the door, and she was very nearly through it when he said, quietly, "Miss Voss." She turned. He was looking at her from across the room with the ledger open in front of him, and his expression was not careful, and it was not closed, and it was not performing anything. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I told you I would," and went out, and closed the door behind her, and stood in the corridor for 3 full breaths before she began walking back toward the schoolroom, with the books in her arms, and the fire's warmth still on her face, and something that was not quite calm, and not quite the opposite of calm, moving through her, like the current moves through deep water, steady, and strong, and invisible from the surface. She reached the schoolroom and put the books on the desk, and sat down in her chair, and looked at them for a while. She thought about what it means when a man who does not say things says a thing. She thought about what it means when a man who has been armored and careful and controlled stands in a room and shows you, for just a moment, the thing beneath the armor, and does not immediately cover it back up. She thought about Philip's stone on the corner of her desk, and Clara's rabbit, and the reading lamp, and the drainage ledger from 1847 that had sent them both to the same room at the same time. She thought about her father's voice saying, "Eleanor, my love," the difficulty with being very good at knowing what is true. She knew what was true. It was the most inconvenient possible thing to know, and she knew it, and she could not unknow it. And she sat at her desk in the November schoolroom, with the books for Philip beside her, and the fire burning behind her, and the moor dark through the window, and she thought, all right. All right. This is true. And now I have to figure out what to do with it. From down the corridor, very faintly, she heard the children's voices coming back from their afternoon walk. Clara's, quick and light, asking something. Philip's, slower, answering. Then laughter. Eleanor straightened her back and picked up her pen and opened her plan for the following week, and began. The summons, when it came, was not dramatic. Edmund called for Mrs. Holt on a Friday morning, the day after Lady Harriet left. He was at his desk in the study when she arrived, and he did not look up from the papers in front of him when she came in, and he said, in a voice he kept entirely level, that he had decided the governess's position was no longer required, and that arrangements should be made for Miss Voss to be settled and conveyed to the station by the following Monday. Mrs. Holt said nothing for a moment. She was standing in the middle of the study with her hands folded in front of her, and he could feel her looking at him, the particular quality of her silence, which was not the silence of a woman who had nothing to say. He waited for her to say something. She did not. "That will be all," he said. She left. He went back to the paper he had been not reading before she arrived, and he read the same paragraph 3 times, and the third time he reached the end of it he could not have told you a single word it contained. It had been, he would not have said at the time, an easy decision, but it had been a clear one, in the way that decisions made from fear are always clear, stripped of nuance and complication, reduced to a single line of action that feels like sense because it is simple, and feels like safety because it removes the thing that frightens you. That was almost the more effective thing about it. She had not raised her voice or made accusations. She had simply been present, on the Friday evening after her long walk in the garden, in the drawing room before dinner, and she had looked at him with those clear blue eyes and said, very pleasantly, that she had thought Miss Voss seemed settled at Ashmore Hall. And he had said yes, she had been very good for the children, and Lady Harriet had looked at her glass and smiled slightly and said, "I understand these positions can become quite comfortable." and had moved the conversation onto something else entirely. It was nothing. It was perfectly nothing. He had replayed it 8 times before breakfast the next morning, and it was still nothing. Just a sentence that meant whatever you decided to make it mean, and he had no reason, none whatsoever, to have sat in the dark in his study at 11 o'clock that night, and felt as if he had been handed a bill of reckoning. He knew what she meant. He was not naive. He had been managing social expectations and their costs since he was 14 years old, and his father had sat him down and explained, with the clear-eyed practicality of a man who had inherited his own obligations young, exactly what it meant to be who he was. It meant responsibility to the estate, responsibility to the family name, responsibility to the tenants and the staff and the community and the people who depended on Ashmore's stability. It meant that what he did mattered, in ways that extended far beyond himself, and that the private and the personal, while not irrelevant, were always and necessarily secondary to the public weight of his position. He had understood that at 14. He had believed it at 20. He still believed it now, at 34. With the added authority of a man who had watched his brother die and spent the past 14 months proving, day by day, that he could hold everything his brother had left behind. The difficulty was that he had spent the past 6 weeks discovering that he was not, in fact, the person he had constructed himself to be. Or rather, he was that person, but he was also something else, something underneath the structure and the silence and the careful distance, something that had been asleep for a very long time and had been woken by a woman who sat across from him and did not curtsy and said, "The method is mine to determine," and meant it. He thought about the East Wing Library. He thought about it more than he should. He thought about standing in front of the fireplace with his brother's portrait above them and saying his brother's name out loud, which he had not done, he realized, in months, because saying it was difficult and silence was easier, and she had stood there and let the silence be what it was, instead of filling it up with the uncomfortable helpfulness of people who do not know how to be near grief. She had said, "I know that too," and it had been exactly right, and it had been the most frightening thing anyone had said to him in a very long time, because it meant she saw him, actually saw him, not the Duke of Ashmore with his responsibilities and his rules and his closed study door, but the man underneath, and that man was not someone he had allowed anyone to see in so long that the exposure felt like cold air on a wound. He had been moving toward a precipice. He knew it. He had known it for weeks, in the careful, analytical part of himself that was always watching, always assessing, always charting the course. And he had also known, with equal clarity, that he was not going to step back from it of his own accord, because the part of himself that watched and assessed had been comprehensively outvoted by the part that stood outside the schoolroom at night, listening to his wards laugh. Lady Harriet's comment had been the nudge he needed, the step back, neatly administered. He told himself this was right. He told himself this was sensible. He told himself that this was the decision of a man who understood his obligations and honored them, and that Eleanor Voss would find another position without difficulty, and that the children were strong enough now, thanks to her work, to accept a new governess, and that everything would return to the order, and the structure, and the silence that had been, for 2 years before she arrived, perfectly sufficient. He told himself all of this across a desk covered with papers he could not read, through a morning that stretched on with the specific slowness of mornings when you do not want time to continue. At noon, Mrs. Holt came back. She knocked, which she always did, and came in without waiting, which she did sometimes, and stood in the middle of the study, with her hands folded in front of her. "I have informed Miss Voss," she said. "Good," he said. "She received the news without complaint," Mrs. Holt said. She asked about the children's schedule going forward, to ensure a smooth transition. She also asked for an hour after her duties concluded each day, to write references and manage her correspondence. "That is reasonable," he said. "Grant it." "Yes, Your Grace." A pause. "She is a good woman, Your Grace." He looked up at her. She was looking at him, with the expression she very occasionally used, the one that said, "I have managed this house for 20 years, and I will say this once and not again." He said, "Yes, she is." Mrs. Holt said nothing further. She left. Edmund sat in his study until 1 o'clock, and then he went to the dining room and ate a luncheon that he did not taste, and he spent the afternoon going over the drainage survey from 1847, which he had collected from the East Wing Library, and which told him what he already knew, that the original boundary had not been where the tenant claimed it had been. He would write to the estate solicitor in the morning. It was a straightforward matter. The evidence was entirely clear. He went to the East Wing Library once, in the late afternoon, to return the ledger to its proper place. The room was empty. A fire had been lit at some point during the day and was burning down. He put the ledger on the shelf and straightened it, and looked at the table where the natural history volumes Eleanor had been collecting for Philip were stacked neatly, ready to be carried upstairs. He stood there for perhaps a minute, looking at the books. Then he left. That evening, passing the schoolroom floor on his way back from the upper storage room, he heard the children's voices and stopped. Clara was crying. Not dramatically, not the loud tears of a child who wants something, but the quiet, contained crying of a child who is trying not to cry, and not quite succeeding. Philip's voice was very serious and very low, and Edmund could not hear the words. He did not go in. He stood in the corridor and listened to his ward, trying to comfort his younger ward, both of them doing it quietly, so that no one would hear. And he thought about what Mrs. Holt had said to him this morning, and what he had said back. He thought, yes, she is. He went down the stairs and back to his study and poured a small amount of brandy and did not drink it, and sat with it in front of the fire for 2 hours, and went to bed at 11 o'clock and lay awake until past midnight thinking about nothing at all. Outside, the late November wind moved across the moor, cold and serious, and Ashmore Hall sat in it with its lights going out one by one, and the elms in the drive thinned and shifted, and somewhere on the third floor of the East Wing, a fire burned low in a small grate, and a woman who had arrived here with 11 shillings and a leather satchel of primers sat at her writing desk in the dark and did not let herself feel sorry. She was, after all, not the kind of woman who chose the easier path. She had simply been given no choice in which path was available. She packed one book a night, methodically, beginning with the heaviest ones, and she did not think beyond the packing, and she kept her face composed, and she was very good at it, because she had had 4 months of practice at keeping her face composed, around things that had broken. She was good at it. She was nearly certain she was good enough. She had known, from the morning it was delivered, that Monday would come. She had known it with the practical, undeceived part of herself that had always been able to see things as they were, rather than as she wished them. The Duke had decided. The Duke's decisions, in her experience, were delivered cleanly and not revisited. She had 6 days to prepare. She packed her books first, as she had planned, one night at a time, and she wrapped her father's miniature portrait in a piece of cloth, and put it in the side pocket of her trunk, where it would not shift during transit, and she sorted her correspondence into what to keep and what to burn, and she was efficient and organized, and gave herself no time in the evenings to sit and think, because thinking was not going to help anything. The hardest part was the children. Not telling them immediately. She had thought about that for a long time, whether it was kinder to tell them at once or to wait, and she had decided to wait until the Thursday, which would give them the weekend to adjust to the idea, before she left on Monday morning. She had made this decision carefully and rationally, and she was confident it was the right one. On Wednesday, Philip found the first book missing from the shelf. He stood in front of the gap on the shelf for a long time, saying nothing. Then he looked at Eleanor and said, "You are going." It was not a question. He was 8 years old, and he had the particular intelligence of children who notice things adults think they are concealing. "Yes," Eleanor said. She sat down at his level, in the chair beside his desk. "I was going to tell you properly on Thursday." "Why are you going?" he asked. "Because His Grace has decided a change is needed," she said. "It is not about you or Clara. You have both been exceptional." Philip looked at her with his serious dark eyes. "Did we do something wrong?" "No," she said, very clearly. "You did everything right. This is a decision made by adults for adult reasons, and it has nothing to do with you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Clara will be very sad." "I know," Eleanor said. "And I will be very sorry to leave her. I will be very sorry to leave you." Philip looked at his desk. He looked at his arithmetic book, which was open at a problem he had been working through. He looked at the stone on Eleanor's desk, his stone, and then he looked back at her. "Will the next governess read from the map book?" he said. "I am going to leave the map book here," Eleanor said. It belongs in this room now, and I will write in it, inside the front cover, which rivers we covered and which ones we did not, so that whoever comes next knows where to begin. He absorbed this. He was doing the thing he did when he was deciding something, the thinking before speaking, that had been one of the first things she had come to respect about him. "I have something for you," he said finally. He went to his desk and opened the small drawer at the top right and brought out a flat piece of paper that had been folded twice. He held it out to her. She unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing, done in pencil, precise and careful, and unmistakably Philip's hand. It was a map, not of any real place, but of what she recognized, after a moment, as the grounds of Ashmore Hall. The drive with the elms, the east stream and the two bridges, the walled kitchen garden, the moor stretching out from the west boundary. Every feature was there, labeled in small, neat script. At the bottom right corner, in the same small script, it said, "Made by Philip Carew, November 1887, for Miss E. Voss, who stayed." She could not speak for a moment. She folded the map back along its creases very carefully and held it. "This is one of the finest things anyone has ever given me," she said. Philip sat back down at his arithmetic problem. "I know," he said, with the complete simplicity of a child who has told the truth and seen no reason to be modest about it. She told Clara on Thursday morning, and it was as difficult as she had expected. Clara cried, not the controlled, quiet crying of the night after the announcement, but openly, and without pretending not to, with Walter, the rabbit, pressed against her cheek. She did not ask the same question Philip had asked. She asked, "Can I write to you?" "You can write to me," Eleanor said, "and I will write back." "Promise," Clara said, not a question. "I promise," Eleanor said. "Can Walter come and visit you when you have a new place?" Eleanor looked at the rabbit, who regarded her with his permanent expression of small, carved dignity. "Walter is welcome anywhere I am," she said. Clara looked at her for a moment, then she said, "I want you to take him." "Clara, he is yours." "He wants to go with you," Clara said, with the absolute conviction of a 6-year-old who knows the desires of her objects better than they know themselves. "He told me this morning." Eleanor held the rabbit for a moment. It was small and smooth and warm from Clara's hands. "Then I will look after him until you can visit," she said. Clara nodded. Then she climbed into Eleanor's lap, which she had never done before, and sat there for a moment, with her head against Eleanor's shoulder, and Eleanor held her, and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that was more than this. She spent Sunday evening finishing the preparations. The trunk was packed. The books she was leaving were arranged on the schoolroom shelves with the map book in its place of honor at eye level, with the note inside the front cover written in her clearest hand. She left a full plan for the next 12 weeks of lessons on the larger desk, with notes in the margin about each child's strengths and difficulties, and the things that made them come alive. She left the small dark stone from the east stream in the drawer, because it was Philip's stone and he might want it back, and she left nothing else of herself, nothing inadvertent, nothing that would complicate things unnecessarily. She went to bed and did not sleep particularly well, which was not surprising, and she got up at 5 o'clock on Monday morning and washed and dressed and was ready before the house had properly stirred. Mrs. Holt came at 7. She did not say much. She supervised the carrying down of the trunk with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything she did, and then she turned to Eleanor and said, "You will be very missed, Miss Voss," in the same tone she used for everything, neutral and precise, and which this morning, for the first time, cracked very slightly at the last word. "Thank you," Eleanor said, "for everything you told me about the children. It made all the difference." Mrs. Holt looked at her for a moment, then she said, "If you ever need a reference, I will give you the best I have ever written." Eleanor thanked her and went down to the entrance hall, where the carriage was waiting. She did not look for him. She had decided that. She had made a very deliberate decision, in the clear-eyed small hours of that morning, that she was not going to look for him, not going to manage her departure around the hope that he might appear, not going to give herself that kind of expectation to be disappointed by. She was going to walk out of Ashmore Hall with the same dignity she had walked into it with, and she was going to get into the carriage, and she was going to go. She put her coat on in the entrance hall. The hall boy held the door. She walked out into the December morning, which was bitterly cold, The kind of cold that comes with a sky full of cloud, but no rain yet. The held breath cold of weather that has not yet decided what it is going to do. The gravel crunched under her feet. The elms along the drive were completely bare now, nothing left, and the sky beyond them was a flat, heavy gray. The driver helped her in. Her trunk was on the back. The door closed. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and kept her gaze forward, and did not look at the house. The horse began to move. The carriage rolled forward on the gravel, and she heard the familiar sound of it under the wheels, and she breathed slowly, and thought about the next part of her life, which would begin when she got to the station, and which she was going to manage with the same composure she had managed everything else. And it was going to be all right, because she was Eleanor Voss, and she had 11 shillings when she arrived, and a full reference from Mrs. Holt of Ashmore Hall when she left. And she was not the kind of woman who allowed herself to be destroyed by things she could not control. She heard the voice before she understood what was happening. Her name. Once, sharp and clear, from behind the carriage. She turned her head. Through the small rear window she could see the gravel drive stretching back toward the house, and there was a figure on it, moving fast. She stared. He was not wearing a coat. He was not wearing a hat. He was in his morning clothes. No coat, nothing over his jacket, and it had begun to rain. She noticed it now. The first light rain of what was clearly going to be a harder rain, and he was running. The Duke of Ashmore was running down his own drive in the December rain without a coat or a hat, and he was calling her name, and the groom had slowed the horses. She noticed that too. The horse had slowed, as if the groom had decided to have trouble with the reins for no particular reason, and the carriage was barely moving. She did not think about what she was doing. She pushed open the carriage door before it had fully stopped and stepped down onto the wet gravel, and she turned, and he was there, 10 feet away and closing, rain beginning to darken the shoulders of his jacket, his hair wet, his face open in a way she had never seen it, with everything the careful lines of it normally concealed right there on the surface. He stopped. They stood on the gravel in the December rain, looking at each other, with the bare elms overhead, and the house behind him, and the station carriage behind her, and the groom on the box above them giving the rain very close attention. The Duke of Ashmore, who never said things he had not planned, who never moved without knowing where he was going, who had spent 34 years building a structure around himself so complete that he had stopped being able to feel where the structure ended, and he began, stood in his own drive in the freezing rain, without a coat, and looked at her, and said, "I was wrong." The rain came down, light but real. She looked at him. His face was wet. He was shivering slightly, though she did not think it was entirely from the cold. "You already said that," she said, "in the East Wing Library." "I know," he said. "I am saying it again. I was wrong to send you away." He stopped. He was clearly not a man who had done this before, not this specifically, not standing in a rainstorm attempting to say honest things about himself in real time. He pressed on. "I was frightened," he said. "That is the truth of it. I was frightened, and I made a decision that was easier than the alternative, and I knew, when I made it, that it was wrong." She held very still. The rain was on her face now, light and cold. "The children," he said, and then stopped again, and something moved through his expression that was raw and unguarded and completely real. "Philip drew you a map," he said. "He did," she said. "He has not drawn anything in 14 months, the Duke said. "Not since my brother died. He used to draw constantly. I did not think he would draw again." Another pause. His voice was steady, but it was costing him something. "And Clara gave away her rabbit. She said he wanted to come with me," Eleanor said. "Clara does not give things away," he said. "She never has. She holds everything." The rain was coming harder now, the kind of rain that December does in the north, that comes from the moor, and has no warmth in it at all. His jacket was soaked. His hair was flat against his forehead. He did not seem to notice, or did not care. "Edmund," she said, and his name in her mouth was the first time she had said it, the first time she had even let herself think it, and she saw the effect of it move through his expression, like light through water. "I am standing in the rain." "I know," he said. "I am sorry about the rain." "I am not asking you to apologize for the rain," she said. "I am asking you to say what you came down the drive to say." He looked at her. The rain came down between them, and the elms moved in the December wind, and the horse stood patiently, and the groom studied the sky. "Stay," he said. "I am asking you to stay." She looked at him for a long moment. She was very cold, and very wet, and she was standing on a gravel drive in the middle of a December rainstorm, and she did not care about any of it. "I did not leave because I wanted to," she said. "I know," he said. "That was also my fault. And if I stay," she said carefully, "I need you to understand that I will continue to tell you the truth, including when you do not want to hear it." Something moved in his face, the same thing she had seen once before, in the schoolroom doorway. Small and real, and completely unguarded. "I understand," he said. She looked at him for another moment. The rain was very cold, and he was shivering properly now, and she thought, with the practical clarity that never quite left her, that he was going to be unwell if he stood out here much longer. "Then let us go inside," she said, "before you fall ill." He let out a breath that was something between a laugh and relief. Two things she had not often seen together on his face, and which, together, changed it completely. He took a step toward her. Then he stopped himself, because he was still himself, still Edmund Carew, and they were on the drive in full view of the groom and anyone who happened to be at any of the windows of Ashmore Hall, and some things could not yet be said or done on a gravel drive in the rain with an audience. But his hand came out, briefly, and his fingers touched her hand, just once, light and real, and then withdrew. She looked at him. "Come inside," he said. "Yes," she said. They walked back up the drive toward the house, side by side, in the December rain, and the bare elms stood over them like old witnesses who had agreed not to say what they saw, and Ashmore Hall opened its door as if it had been waiting. Inside, in the warm entrance hall, Mrs. Holt was already there, with a towel and a complete absence of surprise on her face. Eleanor suspected that the groom had not slowed the horses by accident. She suspected that Mrs. Holt had been standing near the door since approximately 10 minutes ago. She looked at the housekeeper, who looked back at her with the neutral efficiency of a woman who manages a large house and has every administrative detail entirely under control. "Your rooms are ready," Mrs. Holt said. "Your trunk has been brought back in." Eleanor looked at her for a moment. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt," she said. "Yes," said Mrs. Holt, and turned to attend to something else. She did not go back that night. She had her pride, which was intact, and she had spent enough time at Ashmore Hall to understand that doing things properly mattered, not for social show, but because doing things properly was how you built something that would last, and what was beginning to be built deserved to last. That much she knew with absolute certainty. She stayed at the inn in the village, the one the carriage driver had taken her to at the end of the drive, a small and decent place called the Ashmore Arms, that smelled of wood smoke and old wool, and the particular smell of inns in the north in December. She had a room with a good fire and a basin of hot water, and she dried her coat over the chair by the fire, and washed her face, and sat on the edge of the bed, and breathed. Walter the rabbit sat on the writing table beside the window. She had sent a note to Nell Downing that evening, short and factual, which ended, "I have been asked to return. I intend to. I will write more when there is more to say, which I expect will be soon." She slept well, better than she had slept in 3 weeks. She arrived back at Ashmore Hall the next morning at 9 o'clock. She arrived by the same carriage that had taken her away the day before, driven by the same groom, who said nothing about any of it, and drove with the serene composure of a man who has made his peace with the fact that some journeys go in both directions. The hall boy held the door. Inside, Ashmore Hall was as it always was, the stone floor and the portraits, and the cold, old smell of a house that has been standing long enough to have developed opinions. Mrs. Holt was there. "The children are in the schoolroom," Mrs. Holt said. "They have been there since 7 o'clock. Mrs. Lawson took them breakfast." Eleanor went up. The schoolroom door was open. She heard them before she reached it, Clara's voice, attempting some kind of question, and Philip's, answering it in the careful, methodical way he answered things. She came through the doorway and they both looked up. Clara made a sound that was not quite a word, and got out of her chair at a speed that Eleanor was fairly certain was not safe, and arrived against Eleanor's front with enough force that Eleanor stepped back to absorb it, and held her, and Clara pressed her face against Eleanor's coat, and did not say anything at all. Philip stood up from his chair slowly and walked across the room and stood in front of Eleanor with his serious dark eyes. "You came back," he said. "I came back," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, with the particular weighing look that was so much his own, and then he said, "Good," and turned and went back to his desk and sat down, and picked up his pencil and went back to work. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the schoolroom, with Clara still holding on to her, and Philip bent over his desk, and the fire burning in the grate, and the map book on the shelf, and Philip's stone on the corner of her desk where she had left it, and the natural history volumes in their new place on the top shelf, and the flat gray December light coming through the north windows, and she thought, yes, this is where I am. This is exactly where I am. She spent the morning with the children, and it was the best morning she had had since arriving at Ashmore Hall, because it was the morning after everything, after the things that needed to happen had happened, and the air in the room was lighter for it, in a way she could not have quantified but felt with complete certainty. She saw the Duke once, that day, in the afternoon, when she was coming back from the kitchen garden with Philip, who had been collecting winter rosemary for a botany project. Edmund was crossing the hall toward his study, and he stopped. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and Philip looked at both of them with the observant intelligence of a child who understands more than he lets on, and has decided to be quiet about it. Edmund said, "Miss Voss." Formal, because Philip was there, and because they both understood that some things were going to be built carefully and properly, the way things you want to last are built. "Your Grace," she said, and there was, in the way she said it, something that was not available to observers, but was completely clear to him, a warmth in the formality, a yes inside the protocol. He nodded. He went to his study. The door closed. Philip looked up at Eleanor and said, "He is different today." "Is he?" she said. "He looked at you the way you look at the map book," Philip said, with the complete simplicity of a child reporting a fact. Eleanor considered this. "That is a very interesting observation," she said. "I know," said Philip, and went upstairs with his rosemary. The weeks that followed were not uncomplicated. Nothing worth building is. There were days when Edmund retreated into the careful silence that was his oldest defense, and Eleanor let him, because she understood by now that this was not rejection, but a man who had spent his whole life learning to manage himself, and who was, slowly, learning that managing himself and being present to other people were not mutually exclusive. There were evenings when she was aware of the distance between them, the professional and the social distance, as both a necessary structure and a thing that chafed, and she was patient with it, because she was Eleanor Voss, and patience was one of the things she was good at. They talked, when they could, properly, the way two people talk when they are interested in each other and also in the world, and find that these two interests are difficult to separate. About the children, always, and about the estate, and about the books in the library, and the condition of the roads, and the news from London that arrived in the papers, and gradually, over the weeks that became December and then the turn of the year, about other things, more particular things, the things that make up a person's internal life. He told her about his brother, not all at once, but over time, in the way that a story comes out when you begin to trust the person you are telling it to. He told her about their childhood, the older brother who carried everything, and the younger who was free of it, and how that freedom had been both his brother's gift and his own particular sorrow, because he had watched his brother be joyful and easy with the world, and had never entirely learned how to follow. He told her about the months after his brother died, the weight of the guardianship and the responsibility, and the way that grief, for him, had not come as tears, but as a closing, a drawing in, a making of everything very small and very controlled. She told him about her father, about the clergyman who loved poetry and was terrible with money, and who had given her everything she had except financial security, and how she had spent a long time being slightly impatient with him for that, and how she had spent the 4 months after his death, understanding that impatience had been the other side of love, and that the thing she had wanted, more than anything, was for him to have been with her a little longer. They talked in the library, mostly, in the evenings, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and Mrs. Holt brought tea without being asked, and left it without comment, which was, Eleanor thought, the most eloquent possible thing that a very capable and perceptive woman could do. He asked her, in January, to stay past the original 6 months, to stay indefinitely. He said it with his usual economy of language, with his back to the fireplace and his hands in his pockets, but she heard what was underneath it, and she said yes, and the yes was also, they both understood, about more than the professional question, and they left it there for the time being, clear between them without being spoken aloud, because that was enough, and more would come, when more was ready. The spring came slowly, the way spring comes in the north, without hurry, and without apology. The elms along the drive put out their first small leaves in March, and by April the kitchen garden was green, and the moor was losing its winter gray for something more alive. Philip turned 9 in April, and Eleanor gave him a new atlas, properly up to date this time, and he sat with it for an entire afternoon making notes in the margins in pencil. Clara grew an inch, and then another, and began reading on her own, with the hunger of someone who has understood that books are a door, and not just a room. They were married in May. Quietly, in the church at the edge of the village, with Philip and Clara as witnesses, and Mrs. Holt standing at the back of the church, with an expression that was as near to undone as Eleanor had ever seen it. The day was warm and clear, with a light wind off the moor that moved through the open church door and carried the smell of the spring fields. Edmund did not make a speech at the wedding breakfast. He was not, he had told her more than once, a man for speeches. He said, simply, that he was grateful, and he looked at her when he said it, and she knew what it meant, and she looked back, and that was sufficient. He did not relax, fully, ever. That was not who he was. He was a man who had been formed by responsibility, and who carried it seriously, and she would not have wanted to change that, because it was part of what she loved about him, the weight he gave to things, the care he took. But he laughed more. She heard it, and Philip heard it, and Clara heard it, and responded to it with the pure delight of a child who has been wanting something and found it. He let himself be seen. That was the real change. Not in public, never in the way that required performance, but in private, in the library, and the schoolroom, and the kitchen garden, and the East Wing library, that was now, unofficially, the room they both used most in the evenings. He let himself be present, and visible, and known. And she was present, and visible, and known beside him. And that was the thing, the real thing. The thing that cannot be made into a rule, or a structure, or a principle, because it is just the simple, difficult truth of two people deciding to be real with each other. She told him the truth, always, including when he did not want to hear it, and he listened, always, even when the listening was difficult, which it was, sometimes, and he disagreed, sometimes, and they argued, sometimes, with the honest vigor of two people who respect each other enough to fight for what they think is right. And they came back, always, because coming back was the thing they had both decided, and neither of them, once they had decided it, saw any reason to revisit the decision. Philip said to Eleanor once, the following winter, when he was 9 and very much himself, precise and thoughtful, and beginning to have the ease with the world that had belonged to his father, "I am glad you came back." "I am glad I came back too," Eleanor said. He thought about this. "He would not have gone after you," he said, with a 9-year-old's complete confidence in retrospective analysis, except that he was ready. "I think that is true," Eleanor said. "Ready for things is important," Philip said seriously, and went back to his atlas. She thought about that sometimes, in the months and years that followed, about readiness, and what it takes, and what it costs, about a man standing in a schoolroom doorway listening to his wards laugh, about a moment in an East Wing library when something was said that could not be unsaid, about a December morning, and a drive, and the cold rain, coming down through bare elms, about what it means when a person who has been armored for years stands in the rain without a coat and lets himself be seen, about what it means to come back. They had, by all accounts, a very good marriage. Not an easy one, because no honest marriage is easy, but a good one. A real one. Built of true things said between two people who had both learned, the hard way, that the truth is the only thing worth giving. Clara brought Walter the rabbit to Eleanor's new sitting room at the end of the East Wing on the first evening, and set him on the mantelpiece with the authority of someone arranging something permanent. "He belongs here now," she said. Walter looked out at the room from the mantelpiece, with his expression of small, carved dignity, one leg slightly shorter than the others, and Eleanor straightened him slightly so he was properly centered. "Yes," she said, "he does." And he stayed there, for years and years, watching the room be used, and the fire burn, and the children grow, and the seasons change, outside the tall windows of Ashmore Hall, which was, in the end, exactly what a well-loved object does when it has found the place it belongs.